My husband demanded a divorce and the house. He looked at me across our dining table and said, "You won't be able to afford a lawyer to fight me anyway." I told him, "You're right." A week later, he served me papers in court, only to go pale when the city's most feared divorce attorney sat down beside me and said, "She doesn't need to afford me. I'm her older brother." My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 34 years old, and until recently, I believed in the kind of quiet life people mistake for stability. I had a steady job, a house I had poured years into, and a marriage that looked calm from the outside. No screaming matches, no broken plates, no dramatic exits, just routines. Shared calendars, grocery lists on the fridge, bills discussed over dinner. The kind of relationship people call solid because it isn't loud. Now I know silence can hide a lot. Sometimes it isn't peace. Sometimes it is just distance that has learned how to behave. Evan Mercer and I had been together for 5 years, married for 3. He was the kind of man who liked order, liked appearances, liked feeling prepared before anyone else realized there was something to prepare for. At first, I mistook that for reliability. Later, I understood that control can look a lot like dependability when you still trust the person holding it. The day everything broke open didn't begin like a disaster. It began with bills. I was at the table with a pen in my hand, going over numbers, while rain tapped softly against the kitchen window. Evan sat across from me in one of his pressed button-down shirts, sleeves rolled neatly, posture straight, expression unreadable. We were talking about utilities, insurance, a repair estimate for the guest bathroom, the kind of conversation two people have when they no longer know how to talk about anything that matters. At first, I thought the unease in my chest came from exhaustion. Then I looked at him properly. It wasn't his words that felt different yet. It was the way he was sitting there, too settled, too composed, like he had already lived through this conversation in his head and was only waiting for reality to catch up. Then he said, "I want a divorce." Some sentences hit like a slap. That one didn't. It landed colder than that, cleaner. For a second, I didn't move, not because I was confused, because I understood immediately. This was not frustration, not a threat, not something he would regret in an hour. This was a decision he had made before he ever sat down across from me. I set my pen down. Okay. His eyes flickered. Only for a second, but I saw it. He had expected questions, maybe tears, maybe anger, maybe the kind of pleading that lets the other person feel powerful. I gave him none of that. Then he added the part that mattered more to him, "And I'm keeping the house." That made me look at him fully. The house wasn't abstract to me. It was the place where I had painted walls with my own hands, unpacked dishes, signed paperwork, planted herbs I forgot to water, and spent long nights lying awake beside him when something already felt wrong and I still didn't know how to name it. I held his gaze. Why? He leaned back in his chair, far too comfortable. Because I can. The answer came too quickly to be spontaneous. Then he added, "And because you won't be able to fight me." I didn't interrupt. He must have mistaken my silence for surrender, because he kept going. "You can't afford a lawyer, Naomi, not one good enough to matter. So let's not turn this into something messy." There it was. Not confidence. Certainty. He wasn't asking for agreement. He was delivering an outcome he believed was already locked in. In his version of the story, I was cornered, outmatched, and practical enough to accept it. I nodded slowly. "You're right." That caught his attention. His brows tightened. "What?" "You're right," I said again. "I can't afford a lawyer like yours." I watched his shoulders ease. That tiny relaxation told me more than anything else had. He thought he had handled the hardest part cleanly. He thought all that remained was paperwork. "Good," he said, almost gently. "Then let's not drag this out. It'll be easier for both of us." Easier. That word stayed with me, because it wasn't about kindness. It wasn't about reducing pain. It was about control. He wanted an ending that stayed clean, efficient, and mostly on his terms. I looked down at the envelopes between us and felt something old and tired inside me go still. The strangest part was that I wasn't shocked. Not completely. Looking back, there had been signs, calls he took in the other room. the clipped patience in his voice when I asked simple questions, the slight shift in the way he moved through the house, as if he was already picturing it without me in it. But until that moment, all of it had remained shapeless, easy to excuse, easy to smooth over. Now it had a name. He was leaving. And worse, he was already sure I would lose. For the rest of dinner, we barely spoke. He stood first, carried his plate to the sink, rinsed it carefully, and set it on the rack with the same quiet order he applied to everything. You would have thought we had just discussed changing internet providers. I stayed at the table a little longer. The rain had picked up outside. The window over the sink reflected part of the kitchen back at me. Dim light, empty chair, the vase in the middle of the table holding flowers too old to still be called fresh. Evan walked back in a minute later, phone already in his hand. "I'll have my attorney send something over in the next few days," he said. "Not we should talk. Not, let's figure this out. Just logistics." I looked up at him. "You've already hired one." He paused. Then he gave me that calm expression again. "I've been preparing." Of course he had. That was the thing about Evan. He never liked stepping into uncertainty if he could avoid it. He preferred advantage before conversation, an answer before a question, a finish line mapped before the race even began. I should have felt devastated. Instead, I felt something quieter and sharper than grief. I felt measured, reduced to a conclusion he had already reached. Maybe that was the part that hurt most. Not that he wanted to leave, not even that he wanted the house. It was the way he looked at me when he said I couldn't fight him, like I was someone he had already totaled up and found insufficient. He left the room again to take a call, lowering his voice the second he stepped into the hallway. I couldn't hear every word, just enough. "Yes," he said. "She won't make this difficult." A pause. "No, she knows she can't." I sat there in the quiet kitchen, fingers resting lightly against the wood table, and stared at the dark window until my own reflection looked like a stranger. That was the moment I understood something important. Evan wasn't just counting on my silence, he was counting on my surrender. And for the first time that night, I let myself feel the smallest flicker of something beneath the hurt. Not panic, not rage, something steadier. Because when someone sounds that sure of victory before the first paper is even signed, it usually means they're relying on what they think you don't have. And sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is let them keep believing that. The next few days moved quickly. Too quickly for something that had taken years to build. It wasn't loud. That was the strange part. No arguments, no slammed doors, no emotional explosions to mark the end of what we had been. Just a steady unraveling that made everything feel procedural, like paperwork. Like we were both waiting for the official version of something that had already ended. Evan kept his distance, but not in a way that looked like avoidance, more like efficiency. He moved through the house with a quiet sense of ownership that hadn't been there before, opening drawers, checking documents, making calls, always calm, always controlled, as if the result no longer needed discussion. The first time I noticed the shift clearly was the second night after that conversation. He was in the living room, phone pressed to his ear, pacing slowly near the window. I had walked in without making much noise, and he didn't realize I was there right away. "Yes," he said. "She's not going to fight it." A pause. "No, she already said she can't afford anything serious." Another pause. "Exactly. It'll be straightforward." That word again. I stood there long enough to hear it land properly in my chest, then turned away before he noticed me. Not because I was afraid of hearing more, because I didn't want to interrupt the version of me he had built in his head, the one who wouldn't resist, the one who would make this simple for him. The next morning, he acted like nothing had happened. Coffee brewed at the same time. News played softly in the background. His jacket hung neatly by the door. If someone had walked in, they would have thought we were just another couple moving through a normal routine. But the house felt different. Not empty, divided, like there was an invisible line running through every room and we were both careful not to cross it. By the third day, the paperwork arrived. He didn't make a scene of it. He never did. He walked into the kitchen, placed a folder on the table, and slid it toward me with the same calm precision he used for everything else. "You should look through this," he said. I opened the folder. Divorce papers. Clean, structured, already filled out in a way that made it obvious this had not been rushed. Asset breakdowns, property claims, a proposed division tilted in his favor, though written carefully enough to sound reasonable if you didn't look too closely, especially the part about the house. I didn't touch a pen. "When's the hearing?" I asked. That caught him off guard. Just slightly, but I saw it. "Next week," he said. I nodded. "Okay." He studied me for a moment. "You're coming?" "Yes." A pause. "Why?" The question wasn't hostile. It was confused. Because in his version of this, I wasn't supposed to show up. I was supposed to sign, step back, and disappear quietly from the process. "Because it's my divorce too," I said. He didn't argue, but I saw it again, that small recalculation behind his eyes, like a number in an equation had changed just enough to bother him. He picked up his coffee, took a sip, and nodded once. "All right." Then he walked out. That became the pattern of the next few days. Short conversations, controlled movements, separate spaces. He took more calls in the other room, sometimes stepped outside mid-conversation, lowered his voice when I got close, not hiding it completely, just enough to keep me outside the frame. But once you start listening differently, you don't need full sentences. You just need fragments. She agreed. It's clean. No complications. Every word built the same picture. He wasn't guessing. He was operating as if the ending had already been signed. On the 5th day, he came home earlier than usual. I was on the couch with my laptop open but untouched when he walked in. He looked satisfied, not happy, not relieved, just settled, like something had gone exactly the way he expected. "They've confirmed everything," he said, setting his keys down. I looked up. "Everything?" "The hearing, the structure, it's all in place." I closed my laptop slowly. "Good." That seemed to please him. "You should really sign before then," he added. "It'll make things smoother." There it was again. Not a suggestion, a direction. I tilted my head slightly. "Smoother for who?" He didn't hesitate. "For both of us." I held his gaze for a second longer than usual. Then I smiled. Not warmly, just enough. "I'll think about it." That was the first time his expression tightened in a way he didn't immediately recover from. Not anger, not frustration, just a flicker of uncertainty. He nodded once, like he was accepting the answer, but I could see it in the way he picked up his keys again, set them back down, then adjusted his sleeve for no reason at all. A small disruption, nothing more. But it was there. That night, I walked through the house slowly. The hallway, the guest room, the kitchen, the bedroom we used to share without thinking about space or sides or silence. I stopped at the front door and rested my hand lightly against the wall. The house didn't feel like his. It didn't feel like mine either. It just felt unfinished, like something important had been decided without all the facts being on the table, and that thought stayed with me. Because the more I replayed his words in my head, "You can't afford a lawyer. You won't fight me. It'll be straightforward," the clearer something became. Evan wasn't just relying on money. He was relying on a version of me that no longer existed. The woman who would avoid conflict, the woman who would prioritize peace over fairness, the woman who would accept whatever version of the story was handed to her, as long as it meant things didn't get messy. That version of me had started fading the moment he decided I wasn't worth explaining things to. The moment he stopped seeing me as someone who could push back. The moment he turned me into a conclusion instead of a person. By the time the hearing approached, we barely spoke. No arguments, no closure, just distance. On the morning of the court date, he left before me, dressed sharp, composed, phone already in hand. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. In his mind, this was already over. I left about 20 minutes later. No rush, no panic, just a quiet, steady calm that had nothing to do with acceptance and everything to do with timing. Because the truth was, I hadn't lied to him. I really couldn't afford a lawyer like his, and that was exactly why I never tried. The courthouse was already half full when I arrived. That low murmur of voices filled the hallway. Lawyers flipping through files, people shifting in their seats, the soft echo of footsteps against polished floors. It was the kind of place where everything felt important, even the silence. I spotted Evan immediately. He was standing near the front of the room, posture straight, one hand resting lightly against the back of a chair while the other held a file. His lawyer stood beside him, tall and composed, in a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. They were speaking in low tones, calm and controlled, prepared. Evan noticed me a second later. His eyes moved to me, then instinctively past me, looking for someone. When he realized I was alone, I saw it. Relief. It wasn't obvious. He didn't smile. He didn't fully relax. But there was a subtle easing in his shoulders, like a prediction had just been confirmed. I walked in without rushing. No hesitation, no performance, just steady. I took my seat without saying a word. Across the room, Evan leaned toward his lawyer and murmured something. The lawyer glanced at me briefly, then nodded. That look said everything. Exactly as expected. The room filled gradually. Papers shuffled, chairs scraped softly across the floor. A clerk moved back and forth with quiet efficiency. Everything felt routine. For them. For me, it felt like standing in the center of something that hadn't fully revealed itself yet. Evan didn't approach me. He didn't try to talk. There was nothing left for him to say. Not in the version of the story he had written for me. In his mind, this wasn't a conflict. It was a formality. A process where outcomes followed assumptions, and his biggest one was sitting right in front of him, that I had come here alone. A few minutes passed, then the door opened again. It wasn't loud, just a shift in the air, like something had entered the room that didn't belong to the same rhythm as everything else. I didn't turn immediately. I didn't need to. I heard the footsteps, slow, even, measured in a way that didn't ask for attention, but pulled it anyway. They stopped beside me. A chair slid back, then forward, and someone sat down. Only then did I turn, and I didn't look at him first. I looked at Evan, because he had already seen. The color had drained from his face so quickly it was almost disorienting. Not completely. He still held himself together, but enough that the difference was undeniable. The calm certainty he had carried into the room cracked on contact. His eyes locked onto the man sitting beside me, then flicked back to me, then back again, like his mind was trying to reject what it was seeing. His lawyer noticed the change and leaned in to whisper something. This time, Evan didn't respond, because now it wasn't just unexpected. Now it was a problem. The man beside me didn't rush. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't look around the room like he needed to establish anything. He simply set his briefcase on the table, adjusted his sleeve, and looked forward like he had done this 1,000 times before. The difference wasn't in what he did. It was in how everyone else reacted. People recognized him, not loudly, not openly, but in the way conversations softened, in the way a few heads turned a second longer than necessary, in the way the air shifted, almost imperceptibly, around his presence. Evan's lawyer straightened, not dramatically, but enough to show that whatever confidence he had walked in with was now being reconsidered. Evan swallowed. I could see it in the tension in his jaw. He knew enough to be unsettled. The man beside me finally turned his head, just enough to look directly at Evan. "Good morning," he said. 2 words, calm, even, but they landed heavier than anything else in the room. Evan didn't answer. He just stared, waiting for an explanation that would make this make sense again. His lawyer spoke first. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said, polite but firm. "This is a private matter." The man beside me didn't even look at him. No misunderstanding. His voice didn't rise. If anything, it stayed almost too calm, which made it worse. Because it wasn't the calm of someone unsure. It was the calm of someone fully in control. Then he looked at Evan again and said, "She doesn't have to afford me. I'm her older brother." Silence followed. Not ordinary silence. Complete silence. The kind that settles only when everyone in the room understands that something significant has just shifted. Evan blinked once, then again, like he needed a second for the words to catch up with what his face had already understood. "That's not possible," he said quietly. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even denial in the dramatic sense. It was the sound of certainty losing its footing. Julian didn't argue. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Confidence doesn't explain itself. It just sits there and waits for everything else to adjust around it. Evan's lawyer looked at him properly now, not with the quick professional glance from before, but with real attention. Recognition settled in, and with it, a problem. A real one. The hearing was called to order moments later, but nothing felt the same. Not for Evan, not for his lawyer, and not for me. because the balance had already shifted before a single argument was made. Up until that moment, Evan had been operating on one core belief, that I wouldn't contest anything in a way that mattered. Now that belief was gone, and without it, everything else started to wobble. His lawyer began first, structured, professional, controlled. He laid out Evan's position with precision: assets, timelines, contributions, property ownership. Every detail framed carefully, presented in a way that made it sound reasonable and inevitable. It was a strong case. It would have worked if no one had challenged the framing. Then Julian spoke, and the difference was immediate. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to counter every point. He listened to the full argument first, then answered with calm, deliberate precision. He didn't argue emotionally. He dismantled. He pointed to financial contributions that had been simplified, documents that had been described too broadly, and property terms that were less absolute than Evan's filing suggested. He clarified that the house was not as cleanly his as he had presented, that the payment history, the way expenses had been shared, and the structure behind the claim all required closer review before any clean transfer could be assumed. Every sentence was measured, every point specific, no wasted words, no dramatics, and that made it worse, because there was nothing to push against, no anger to dismiss, no weakness to exploit, just clarity. Evan shifted in his seat, small but visible. His confidence wasn't gone yet, but it was no longer stable. Now there was calculation underneath it. For the first time since this started, he wasn't sure. I didn't speak much. I didn't need to. For the first time, I wasn't the one being underestimated. At one point, I glanced at Evan. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at the table, listening carefully, processing every word Julian said, because now he understood something he hadn't before. This wasn't going to move cleanly in the direction he had planned. By the time the hearing paused, nothing had been finalized. No ruling, no official outcome. But it didn't matter, because the quick result he had counted on was already gone. Outside the courtroom, he approached me. Not fast, not confident, carefully. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. I looked at him, really looked at him this time. Not at the man I had married, at the man who had already decided who I was without asking. "Tell you what," I said. "That he's your brother." I held his gaze for a moment, then shrugged lightly. "You didn't ask." His jaw tightened. "This changes everything." I nodded once. "I know." A pause stretched between us. Then he exhaled and said, "You told me you couldn't afford a lawyer." I met his eyes without blinking. "I said I couldn't afford one like yours." That was when it fully landed. Not just the situation, the mistake, because he hadn't misread my finances. He had misread me. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Not because he had run out of words, but because whatever he had planned to say no longer fit the moment. I could see his mind trying to adjust, trying to find a way back into control. But once control is built on a false premise, there isn't much left to stand on when that premise gives way. "This didn't have to go like this," he said finally. His voice was lower now, careful, chosen. I looked at him calmly. "It didn't." He glanced back toward the courtroom doors as if expecting someone to step out and tell him it could still be fixed. "They're going to drag this out now," he said. "Your brother's going to make this complicated." I almost smiled, not because it was funny, because of how familiar that sounded. Complicated, messy, difficult, all the things he had tried so hard to avoid by making sure I would never contest anything in the first place. "Only if it already is," I said. He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said quietly, "if everything was as clear as you said it was, there wouldn't be this much to review." That landed harder than anything I had said so far. He looked at me like he was searching for the version of me that used to soften conversations like this. But she wasn't there anymore. Inside the courtroom, the hearing resumed. This time, Evan didn't sit the same way. He leaned forward, listened more closely, interrupted less. His lawyer spoke again, but now there was caution under every sentence, like each claim had to be tested before it could be trusted. Because now it could be challenged. And it was. Julian stayed precise, patient, ruthless in the quiet way that mattered. At one point he said, "Let's clarify the ownership structure of the property." Evan's lawyer began to respond, then paused, because the document in front of him no longer supported the broad confidence of the argument he had opened with. A clause, a payment record, a detail that looked small until someone competent put it in the right place. Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't push theatrically. He simply laid each point down and let the silence after it do its work. One by one, the picture Evan had presented started to weaken. The house wasn't clearly his in the way he had claimed. The contributions weren't one-sided. The agreements weren't as settled as he had made them sound. None of that guaranteed a dramatic reversal on its own, but together it was enough to stop the outcome he had walked in expecting. I watched Evan as it happened, the sharpening of his focus, the tightening in his jaw when a point didn't land the way he needed it to, the way he stopped looking at me entirely, because now I wasn't the variable anymore. The case was. At one point, his lawyer leaned toward him and whispered quickly. This time, Evan nodded slower, more cautious. That was the real shift. Not loud, not theatrical, just undeniable. The version of him who had entered that room already halfway to victory was gone. By the time the session paused again, nothing had been decided. No ruling, no final winner. But the easy outcome he had built his whole strategy around no longer existed. Outside, the hallway felt different, quieter, not because fewer people were there, but because the noise no longer mattered. Evan stepped out a few seconds after me. He didn't check his phone, didn't go straight to his lawyer. He walked toward me, slower this time. "We can still settle this," he said. There it was. Not a demand, an offer. I turned to face him. "Settle what?" "This," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the courtroom. "All of it. We don't have to escalate things." I held his gaze. "You already did." He opened his mouth, then stopped, because he knew. The moment he decided I wouldn't push back was the moment he escalated everything. "I was trying to keep it simple," he said. "No," I replied. "You were trying to keep it one-sided." That hit. I saw it in the way his expression changed. Not anger, not defensiveness, recognition, the kind that comes too late to fix anything. For a second, he looked like he might argue. Then he didn't, because there was nothing left to argue about. Just consequences. Julian stepped out behind me, adjusting his sleeve, his expression as calm as it had been all day. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Evan glanced at him once, then back at me. "This isn't over," he said. I nodded. "I know." But this time, neither of us meant the same thing. The rest didn't happen all at once. It unfolded slowly, but with the kind of certainty that can't be reversed once the facts are properly laid out. In the weeks that followed, everything Evan had tried to present as clean and settled became visible in a different light. Documents were reviewed properly. Payment records were checked instead of summarized. Property terms were read as written, not as he had described them. And once everything was examined closely, one thing became impossible to ignore. The house was never just his, not fully, not in the way he had insisted. There were details, small on their own, solid together, that changed the shape of his claim. Contributions that had been minimized, terms that had been glossed over, joint decisions he had treated as if they were his alone. This time, those details didn't disappear into silence. They were acknowledged, recorded, counted. Evan didn't fight the way I once thought he might. Not loudly, not aggressively, because this was no longer the kind of situation confidence alone could carry, not when the foundation of his position had already cracked. We spoke less and less during that time, not out of anger, out of clarity. There was nothing left to misunderstand, nothing left to fix. Only the slow process of letting things land where they should have been from the beginning. The day everything was finalized didn't feel dramatic. No big confrontation, no triumphant speech, just a quiet conclusion to something that had ended long before the paperwork caught up. The house stayed, not as a prize, not as a victory, just where I was. Evan left with what was his. And for the first time since all of this started, neither of us tried to control how the ending looked. A few weeks later, I walked through the house alone. Morning light came in through the same windows, the same ones I had stood in front of months earlier, staring at my reflection and trying to understand what had just happened to my life. But it felt different now, not empty, clear. There is a difference between silence that suffocates you and silence that finally lets you breathe. I didn't rush to fill it. I didn't turn on the TV just to make noise. I just stood there for a while and let the quiet settle in a way it never had before. I thought about that night at the table, the way Evan had looked at me when he said I couldn't fight him, the certainty in his voice, the confidence that came from believing he had already solved the outcome. And I realized something that stayed with me long after everything was over. He didn't fall apart because I produced some miracle. He fell apart because he stopped paying attention. He stopped seeing me as someone who could surprise him, someone worth asking questions about, someone who might have more behind her than what he could see on the surface. He turned me into an assumption. And once you do that, you stop noticing the details that can undo you. I heard later that things didn't go the way he expected after everything was finalized. Not because anything dramatic happened, because reality rarely bothers with drama, but because plans built on incomplete information don't survive close scrutiny for very long. As for me, I stayed, not out of habit, not out of sentiment, but because for the first time in a long time, the space I was standing in actually felt like it belonged to me, fully, clearly, without negotiation. And if there's one thing I learned from all of this, it's simple. The moment someone decides you can't push back is usually the moment they stop preparing for the possibility that you will. And that's exactly when everything they built starts to give way.